but still fought valiantly for the cause of freedom. He wrote of the escapees from slavery he met, men, women, and children who sought refuge in the Union lines, hoping for a life of freedom they had never known. Thomas described the solemn duty he felt to protect them and ensure their escape to the North, where they could live free of the chains of slavery.
I've seen the faces of those who are free now, and I know that what we're fighting for is worth every moment of suffering.
Thomas wrote in one letter.
Every man I see running towards the Union line reminds me that we are not just fighting for our country, but for their lives, their futures.
But as much as Thomas believed in the righteousness of his cause, his letters also revealed the deep sorrow and despair he felt. He had seen the toll the war had taken on the men around him, the weight of the deaths and the emotional strain of being thrust into a conflict so brutal that it seemed impossible to comprehend. Thomas's idealism and hope for a better world clashed with the harsh, brutal reality of war. Like Benjamin, he had been changed by the war, no longer the boy who had left home, but a man hardened by the atrocities he had witnessed. Samuel and Elizabeth clung to the hope that their sons were finding strength in each other's words, that the letters they exchanged, though brief and infrequent, served as a reminder that they were not alone in their suffering. But even as they tried to hold on to hope, they could not ignore the deepening sense of loss that had settled over their home. The war, which had once seemed distant, now felt all-encompassing, leaving them consumed by worry, fear, and an aching desire for peace. The emotional divide between Benjamin and Thomas, once a source of painful tension, was now a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. Though Samuel and Elizabeth had tried their best to remain neutral, to show equal love and support to both sons, the truth was undeniable. The war had torn their family apart. Their home, which had once been filled with laughter and warmth, now felt hollow. Every letter they received from their sons was a reminder of the cost of the war, the separation, the grief, and the uncertainty of whether their family would ever be whole again. Samuel, once a man of quiet strength, found himself struggling with the weight of his own conflicting emotions. He had always been proud of both of his sons for their strength of character, but now he was faced with the painful reality that those very convictions had torn them apart. Elizabeth, too, was overwhelmed by the sorrow of knowing that her children were fighting in a war that could leave them irreparably damaged. The love she had for her sons seemed to be the only thing that remained constant in the midst of the chaos. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the Johnsons found themselves yearning for the end of the war. They longed for a time when they could reunite as a family, when the haunting letters and constant worry would cease. But in their hearts, they knew that the war had already taken a toll that could never be fully healed, even when the guns fell silent and the bloodshed ended. For Samuel and Elizabeth, the cost of war was measured not just in the lives lost, but in the deep emotional scars that would take a lifetime to mend. The realization that their family had been forever changed by the war weighed heavily on their hearts. Samuel and Elizabeth knew that the physical wounds of their sons could heal with time, but the emotional and psychological toll of the war would last far longer. All they could do now was pray for the safe return of their sons and hope that, somehow, the deep divide between them could one day be healed. The news arrived like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile peace the Johnson family had tried to hold on to. Both Benjamin and Thomas had been severely injured in separate battles. The letters that came alongside the news were sparse, their details minimal but chilling. Benjamin had been wounded in a skirmish near Chattanooga, and Thomas had been injured during a bloody clash at Gettysburg. Their injuries were grave, the letters said, but they were alive, barely. The family's worst fears had come to fruition. For Samuel and Elizabeth, the world seemed to collapse around them. Their two sons, who had once been full of life and promise, were now lying wounded and broken on distant battlefields, the very war that had torn their hearts apart now threatening to take their lives. In that moment, the divide between the North and South, between the Union and the Confederacy, between their two sons, seemed utterly insignificant compared to the dire situation they faced. The political causes and ideologies that had once defined their family's conflict were swallowed up by the unbearable weight of their pain and love for their sons. Samuel and Elizabeth wasted no time. They put aside their fears, their doubts, and even the differences that had grown between them as they tried to navigate the impossible situation of having two sons fighting for opposing sides. They gathered what little they could and made the long, arduous journey to the battlefield. Their hearts raced with dread, each mile between them and their sons feeling like an eternity. They had no idea what they would find, only that they needed to be with their children, to hold them, to offer comfort in their darkest hour. When they arrived, the battlefield was a scene of devastation. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, the ground scarred by the remnants of violence. Everywhere they looked, there were soldiers, some dead, others wounded, all haunted by the trauma of war. The Johnsons' search for their sons took them to a makeshift medical camp where the wounded were being cared for. It was there, amidst the chaos and despair, that they found Benjamin and Thomas, side by side on cots, their bodies bruised and broken, their faces pale from loss of blood. Benjamin's face was a picture of exhaustion and pain. His right leg had been shattered in the fighting, and his right arm was wrapped in bandages. He barely looked up as his parents approached, his eyes clouded with fatigue and sorrow. Beside him, Thomas lay with his arm in a sling and bandages wrapped around his chest. His face, too, was pale, but there was a flicker of recognition when he saw his parents. His lips trembled slightly, and he reached out with his good hand to grasp his mother's. Samuel and Elizabeth stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight of their sons. The children they had raised, who had once bickered and played together on their family farm, were now war-torn men, their lives altered forever by the conflict that had divided not only the nation but their own family. There were no words, no explanations needed. In that quiet moment, the space between their ideological divisions seemed to disappear. The love they had for their sons, the longing for peace, the hope for unity, it all came rushing to the forefront, overwhelming the sorrow and grief that had consumed them for so long. Elizabeth dropped to her knees beside Thomas, her hands trembling as she stroked his forehead. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered words of comfort, words she had longed to say in all the months of separation. Samuel, equally overcome, knelt beside Benjamin, clasping his son's hand in his own. He had spent so many nights worrying over Benjamin's safety, praying for his return. Now that he was here, wounded but alive, Samuel felt a profound sense of relief and sorrow wash over him.
Benjamin, Thomas,
Samuel whispered, his voice choked with emotion. You're both here. You're alive. The brothers, too, could hardly speak. Benjamin's voice cracked as he spoke, his words heavy with exhaustion.
I'm sorry, Pa. I didn't know how much it would hurt, how much this would cost.
Thomas's eyes filled with tears as he looked at his brother.
I didn't know either, Ben. I didn't know.
In that moment, they were no longer soldiers fighting for opposing causes. They were brothers, two young men who had been torn apart by the war, but who, in their suffering, found a bond stronger than any political ideology. Samuel and Elizabeth looked at their sons, and the weight of their grief began to lift, replaced by a quiet understanding. The war had stolen so much from them, but in that painful reunion, they had regained something far more precious, the love that had once united them. As they sat beside their sons, holding them close, Samuel and Elizabeth finally understood the true cost of the war. It wasn't just the battles fought on the fields, it was the toll it had taken on families, on brothers, on the very fabric of society. They understood now that the fight for freedom, for justice, for equality, it came at a price far greater than any of them had anticipated. The scars of war were not just on the body, but on the heart, on the soul. And yet, in that painful moment, love and compassion triumphed over all. The division that had once seemed so insurmountable between their sons and their country now faded into the background. They were simply a family again, united by a common bond of love, a bond that the war had not been able to destroy. Samuel and Elizabeth held their sons through the long hours of the night, comforted by their presence, even as the weight of what they had lost hung heavily in the air. The world outside might still be at war, but in this small moment, they found peace, a peace built not on victory or defeat, but on the power of love and the unbreakable ties of family. When the Civil War finally came to an end, it left behind a fractured nation, one that had been torn apart by years of bloodshed, hatred, and division. For Samuel and Elizabeth, the end of the war marked not only the cessation of conflict, but also the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, one that would be focused on healing, both personal and communal. The war had stolen so much from the Johnson family. Their sons, Benjamin and Thomas, had been irreparably changed by the horrors they had witnessed. They had both survived, but the scars, physical and emotional, would stay with them forever. However, the Johnson family, bound by a love that had withstood the harshest of trials, was determined to move forward. They knew that if they were to heal, they must start by mending the broken pieces of their own hearts and then extend that healing to the community around them. Returning to their farm, which had stood through the war's devastation, was both a comfort and a challenge. The land, once a symbol of peace and prosperity, had been neglected during their absence. The crops had withered, the fences had fallen into disrepair, and the house, though still standing, bore the marks of years of hardship. Yet it was home, and it was here that they would begin again. The Johnsons found solace in the simple routines of farm life. They worked together to restore the land, just as they worked to restore the bonds that had been stretched to their breaking point. Benjamin, though still carrying the physical and mental scars of war, found a sense of purpose in the fields, his hands once again touching the earth he had grown up on. Thomas, though deeply affected by his experiences, threw himself into the labor as well, helping his parents as they worked tirelessly to rebuild their lives. But the healing process didn't stop at the family farm. Samuel and Elizabeth, both understanding the depths of suffering and division, knew that true healing would require something more than just personal reconciliation. Their community, too, had been ravaged by the war. Families had been divided, friendships had been torn apart, and old wounds had festered. It was clear to Samuel and Elizabeth that if they were to move forward, the town itself needed to heal. Samuel, with his deep sense of integrity and compassion, began reaching out to his neighbors, encouraging them to come together and put the bitterness of the past behind them. Elizabeth, with her unyielding strength and conviction, took on the role of advocating for forgiveness. She held gatherings where former soldiers, both Union and Confederate, could share their stories, find common ground, and begin the process of healing. The Johnson family's message was simple but profound. Reconciliation was not about forgetting the past or pretending that the pain never happened. It was about acknowledging the wounds, understanding their origins, and then choosing to heal together. Samuel often reminded the people of Harmony that the future was built on the strength of unity, and that true freedom could only be achieved through forgiveness, compassion, and shared purpose. The transformation in the town was gradual, but it was powerful. At first, many were hesitant, still holding on to the anger and resentment that the war had fostered. But as time passed and the Johnsons continued their efforts, the walls of division slowly began to crumble. Former enemies became allies. Neighbors who had once been bitter rivals now worked side by side, and the community, once divided, began to mend. The Johnson family, through their example of resilience and their commitment to unity, became a symbol of hope for others. Their story of healing after the war spread throughout the town, inspiring others to reconcile with their pasts, both personal and collective. People began to see that the war, though it had caused immense suffering, could not be the end of the story. It was a painful chapter, yes, but there was more to life than bitterness and division. As the years went by, the Johnson family continued to be a beacon of strength in their community. They held annual gatherings, bringing together families who had once been torn apart by the war. They shared meals, told stories, and celebrated the progress they had made. Benjamin and Thomas, though forever changed by their experiences, found peace in the knowledge that they had been part of something greater, something that transcended the battlefield. The Johnsons' farm flourished once again, as did the town of Harmony. The land, once scarred by war, was now abundant with life. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, the kind of sounds that had been absent during the darkest days of the conflict. The pain of the past was still present, but it was no longer a force that held them back. Instead, it had become the foundation of a new, stronger unity. Samuel and Elizabeth knew that the road to healing was long, but they were not alone. The love they had for their sons, the compassion they had shown to their neighbors, and the forgiveness they had extended to one another had created a ripple effect in the community. The scars of war were still there, but they no longer defined the future. In the end, the Johnson family's journey was a testament to the enduring power of love, forgiveness, and unity. Their story became a powerful reminder that, even in the face of the deepest divides, the human spirit has the strength to rebuild, to heal, and to rise again. The war had taken much from them, but it had also given them the opportunity to show the world the true cost of division and the incredible healing that can occur when people come together in love and understanding.
A family torn, unsure what to do. With letters sent through the cannon's roar.